I was born and raised in Los Angeles. I've lived in San Francisco. I've also lived in the states of Missouri and Connecticut. And everywhere I go throughout my life, I've been asked 3 questions, or there have been some assumptions that have been made about me. The first question I get, or comment that I get, is, oh my gosh, you speak English so well. And then we get into the whole conversation of, oh, I was born in California and I was raised here. I've lived my entire life pretty much in the United States. And then if someone is a little more persistent, then they say, no, but really, where are you from? And then I go, okay, well, my parents immigrated from Korea, so I'm Korean. And they're like, oh, okay. And then the second question I get after they figure out that I'm Korean is, oh, well, are you from North Korea or South Korea? Okay, so there's this assumption that Korea has always been divided, which, of course, is not the case. And the third assumption that I often get is that I'm really good at math. And you can ask any of my friends, I am awful at math. And I still remember this, my 6th grade teacher, you have elementary school, well, where I went to school, elementary school until the 6th grade, and then you go into middle school in the 7th grade. And my math teacher said, I'm going to put you in honors math. And at 12, or however old you are in 6th grade, I was like, I guess I'm good at math. Like, I always thought I really struggled in math, but apparently I'm really good at math. So I got placed into honors math in 7th grade, and I failed. and my 7th grade teachers were like, you are not good at math, we're going to put you in regular math. So then I was like, okay, that's kind of what I thought. So there are these 3 kinds of assumptions, right? This marveling over the fact that I speak English well, and this question over whether I'm North Korean or South Korean, and this assumption that I'm really good at math. Okay, so I wanted to today, and it's really natural to categorize, right? If we didn't categorize, we'd be in trouble. If I thought that this was a pen and a pen was a piece of paper, I'd have some problems. So it's really natural to categorize. But the problem comes in when meanings are attached to certain categories and when assumptions are being made about a particular person or an entire group of people. And that's how we get stereotypes. Right? So today I wanted to trace Korean American history as it relates to these questions that I've been asked continually throughout my life. And I wanted to do this first to try and explain why people tend to make certain kinds of assumptions about Korean Americans, and second, to provide the historical grounding behind why these assumptions exist. They don't come from nowhere, right? They're grounded in historical reality. So I wanted to talk about that. Okay, so let's go to this first question about me speaking English so well. So the United States, as we know, it's a country of immigrants, right? The only native population is Native Americans, but everyone else came to this country. But I think it's very rare that if you are an Anglo-American, that you're asked where you are from. But I think that if you're Asian American, it's really common to be asked, where are you from? Okay, so there's this assumption that Asian Americans are foreigners, that they're recently arrived, or that they don't belong here. And this is something that is directly connected to US immigration history. So I wanted to start by giving you a really broad sketch of Asian American history and Asian American immigration to the United States. So before I jump into this, first of all, I want you to raise your hand if you're Asian American and you were, either you or your parents immigrated to the United States. So raise your hand if you're Asian American and either you or your parents immigrated to the United States. Okay, so quite a few of you, including myself. This has a lot to do with our immigration laws. In 1965, chances are that you or your parents came to the United States after 1965, because this is when the US has an immigration law that opens up immigration from Asia. Prior to 1965, immigration from Asia is largely closed. Okay, so we're going to talk about that history right now. And in order to do this, we have to go back to the 1800s. So let's go back to the 1800s. All right, so I want you to dig back into your grade school learning. What happens in California in 1849? Sorry? Gold, okay. All right, gold is discovered in California. And this really dramatically changes the demographics of California. You have people coming over from across the continental US, you have people coming from South America, you have people coming from Europe, and you have people coming from China. And everyone is coming here to strike it rich. And it's said that in the beginning, everyone kind of got along okay, But soon there was fierce competition, right? Gold was limited. It was available, but not everybody was striking it rich. So this created competition between groups of people who were here to strike it rich. What happened was that a lot of the people, a lot of the 49ers, right, who came here didn't necessarily intend to stay in California. But after the gold dried up, a lot of people found that they were stuck here. And the Chinese were among this group of people who found out that they couldn't really get back to China. So they had to find jobs, okay? This is the time of the Transcontinental Railroad. A lot of them found jobs in mining. A lot of them found jobs working in the railroads, building the railroads. And they were viewed as being very peculiar, okay? Employers decided that because of their difference, at this point in time, the Chinese men typically had shaved heads in the front, really long braids or queues in the back. They were described as wearing pajama-like clothing. And employers decided to use that difference to justify paying them less for the work that they did. So you have an unequal wage system occurring at this time. Well, there were European immigrants who also needed jobs, and they were starting to get upset, believing that the Chinese were undercutting their wages. And so there was growing anti-Chinese sentiment throughout the latter half of the 1800s. And there was this desire to get the Chinese out of California in particular, but out of the United States entirely. And so this leads to our first race-based immigration law. Okay, this leads to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And this pretty much bans immigration from China to the US. Okay. So a few years later, in 1898, is another kind of big marker in Asian American history. The US expands outward into the Pacific in 1898. And the US annexes Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, Puerto Rico. And as we know, Hawaii is pretty close to California, right? So let's think for a minute, what is the big crop in Hawaii? Does anyone? Sugar. Okay, sugar cane. Have any of you tried sugar cane? It's super tough and sinewy, and so you can imagine trying to cut down sugar cane. It was very hard labor. So it's not as if people were rushing to work in the sugar plantations. And so what the plantation owners did is they brought in contract laborers, and a lot of these contract laborers came from Asia. So you have contract laborers coming from Japan, you have contract laborers coming from the Philippines, and from Korea in the early 1900s. You also had Chinese contract laborers who were coming in, but that the Chinese Exclusion Act that was in place in the continental United States expands to Hawaii in 1902. So Chinese immigration is closed. So you have a very large group of Asian immigrants who are coming into Hawaii. And pretty soon after their contracts were finished, a lot of them decided to move on to something else. And a lot of them ended up coming, especially the Japanese, ended up coming to California to work in agriculture. And as we know from what happened to the Chinese, there was already anti-Asian sentiment in California. So when the Japanese came, there were moves to get the Japanese out. And this began with the 1907 Gentlemen's Agreement Act. And with this act, this prevented the Japanese from using Hawaii as a stepping stone to get into California. And a few years later, in 1917, there's a federal immigration law that cuts off immigration from many parts of Asia. They created what was called an Asiatic barred zone, which included most of India and other parts of Asia. And then in 1924, you have an Immigration and Nationality Act, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act, that cuts off immigration from Asia entirely. So this law basically said, if you cannot naturalize and become a citizen, then you can't come from any of those countries. And at this point in time, no Asians could naturalize and become citizens. So this cut off immigration from Asia entirely. So between 1924 and that 1965 act that I mentioned before, there are a couple little acts. I shouldn't call them little. There were a couple acts that allowed a very nominal number of Asians to come from certain countries, usually around 100 per year. There was the Magnuson Act of 1943 and the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952. But it's really not until 1965 that you get immigration from Asia opened up more broadly, which is when a lot of us and our parents came over. Okay, so I give you this sketch of Asian American history and immigration law to help put Korean immigration in perspective. As we know, all these Asian countries are really different from one another, right? They're not all the same. They speak different languages, they have different cultures. So where do Koreans fit in to this history? The first wave of Korean immigration, I'm going to talk about 3 waves of Korean immigration, came to Hawaii in 1903 to 1905. And the majority of Koreans who came over at this point in time were Korean men who were contract laborers who worked in those sugarcane fields that I talked about before. So you have about 7,300 Koreans who come over at this early juncture between 1903 and 1905. You also have approximately 800 to 1,000 Korean picture brides who come to the US. This was a system that was set up, it's kind of like maybe not, it's kind of like the Facebook of the 1800s, except it ended in definite marriage, so maybe not, what am I thinking of? eHarmony, one of those things. Okay, so you get the idea. So this whole system was set up because there were so many male plantation laborers who were in Hawaii, and there were very few females. And so Japan pretty much instituted this system, this picture bride system, that brought over thousands of Japanese women and approximately 1,000 Korean women to marry Korean and Japanese nationals. This is why you have such a large Asian population in Hawaii. It dates back pretty far. The reason why this immigration window for the first wave of Korean immigrants is so small is because Japan makes Korea a protectorate in 1905. And then in 1910, Japan officially colonizes Korea. And Japan will colonize Korea until the end of World War II, until 1945. So between 1910 and 1945, Japan colonizes Korea, which makes it impossible for Koreans to travel outside for the purposes of migration to the US. And so with this first wave of Korean immigrants, you have a group of Koreans who are actually very concerned about what's happening in Korea. So you have a lot of immigrants who are here who are very involved in the Korean independence movement. So this is An Jung-ho here. He is one of the, he came to California in 1902 with his wife, and he started a bunch of different organizations, and a lot of them were for the purposes of Korean independence. And so a lot of the fundraising that would happen, a lot of the monies would go back to Korea to kind of support this fight against Japan. With this first wave of Korean immigrants, they were very much tied to what was happening in Korea. And I wanted to show you a picture of An Jung-ho because as you guys, or I'm sure a lot of you know, the Korean Studies Institute here on campus is named after the An Jung-ho family, and that's because his family lived in that house at one point. It's kind of a fun thing. All right. So the second wave of Korean immigration is directly tied to the Korean War. And I wanted to give you a little bit of a context of what happens just before this war. Okay, so World War II ends in 1945, and Japan is defeated. And as a result, Japan loses control of its colonies, which means it loses control of Korea. So Koreans are happy. They're like, hooray, we are independent, things are going so great. And then they're immediately occupied and divided. Okay, so this is how Korea becomes divided. Along the 38th parallel, you have the Soviet Union to the north of the 38th parallel, and you have the US to the south of the 38th parallel. So things are great, and then they were divided. Okay, so here is an image of the Demilitarized Zone. It is such a huge physical space. You know, if you were to look at it from a satellite, it has been there for so long that we think that it's permanent, right? A lot of people hope that it won't be permanent, but it's been there for such a long time. I think this gets at the second question that I'm often asked. I think this gets at why, from a US perspective, we always think that Korea has always already been divided, but that is really not the case. It was divided as of 1945, and the reason why it was divided was because of the Cold War. So have any of you heard of the domino theory? Yeah, do you want to tell us what the domino theory is in relation to the Cold War?
Me?
Yeah.
It's like they thought that if one country became communist, then other countries in the region would become communist as well.
Yeah, exactly. So it's the idea that like dominoes, if one country falls to communism, then the rest of the countries in that area would fall to communism as well. So if you look at this map, I know it's small. All right, so, oh wow, that's really small. Okay, so Korea, okay, you see China, right? So Korea is the little peninsula on the very right-hand side, just underneath China. Do you see it there? It's two different colors. So that's Korea. And if you think about where that's situated in the context of East Asia, it is sandwiched between China and Japan. It is located in the center or the heart of East Asia. And this is why Korea becomes so geopolitically important to the United States, because they fear that if Korea falls to communism, then the rest of Asia will fall as well. And this is why the US is so interested in being there. So 5 years after the division, a civil war breaks out between North and South Korea. And our president at the time, President Truman, believes that we need to be involved in this war, again, to assure that Korea remains a democratic country, okay? So the US enters this war, and this is a big war. Like it's one of our America's forgotten wars, but this was a very significant, huge war that involved lots of countries, including China. It involved, I think, 11 UN countries, and it was a very devastating war. 36,500 American servicemen lose their lives in the Korean War, and approximately 3 million Koreans, many of them civilians, die in this war. That's 17% of the ethnic Korean population. This was a war that would change the lives of the people who lived through it. It would follow the Korean Americans who ended up coming to the US in the form of trauma and memory. For example, my mom was really young when the war happened. She lost her father and her oldest sister in that war. There are many memories that are linked to the Korean War, and for many of the first generation Korean Americans, this is still very much present, I think, in their lives. So as a result of this war, you get a second wave of Korean immigrants who come to the United States. So remember that 1924 act that banned immigration from Asia? Koreans for the most part are still not allowed to come to the United States. But after the war, there are some special circumstances for certain kinds of Koreans to come to the United States. So between 1953 and 1965, you have approximately 28,000 Korean military brides who come to the US. You have approximately 13,000 Korean and mixed race adoptees. The children who are mixed race were the children of Korean women and US servicemen. And you have about 6,000 students who come to study in the United States. It's kind of this exchange program, and many of these students end up staying on in the United States. So here's an article. I just wanted to show you some of the articles that were that you would see in the 1950s and the early 1960s. Here's something from the Chicago Daily Tribune. Soldier's Korea bride arrives in a strange city, and it follows the story of this Korean bride, Chung-hee Keller. Here's an image of Kang-gu Ri, who was a Korean adoptee. And Americans were already familiar with this young boy because during the war, his face was used on war relief posters. And then he was adopted into the US in 1956. And so here you have Life magazine chronicling his arrival. And it shows him riding carousels and talking on the telephone and watching TV and doing these kind of all-American things. And this narrative of rescue, this narrative of rescuing Korean children and mixed race children was really prominent throughout the 1950s. It was kind of a way, I believe, for Americans to grapple with the fact that they fought this really tragic war and didn't really win, right? Because we ended up back at the 38th parallel. And the third wave of Korean immigration comes as a result of that Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. And today, more than 95% of Korean Americans consist of post-1965 immigrants and their children. So the population of Korean Americans in the US as of 2009 was over 1 million. And with this immigration law, there was a preference system. So you could come in through family reunification. So remember I talked about the military brides right now? It is said that over 40% of Koreans who came to the US after 1965 are somehow a relative of a Korean military bride. And they came in through this clause of family reunification. Another group of Koreans that came in under the occupation clause of this Immigration Act, and this was to fill certain niches and certain needs in terms of employment on the US side. So this was both low-skilled and high-skilled employees who came in. And the wives and children of US servicemen were allowed to come in under non-quota status, which means that they weren't counted towards the 20,000 annual cap that was given to each of these countries. Okay. So this is when the bulk of Koreans come to the United States. And there are a lot of other reasons as to why Koreans chose to come here. I mean, if you think about it, the war, of course, really tied Korea, it still does, ties South Korea and the US together. But there were other things that were happening in Korea that urged Koreans to come to the United States. One was that there was a low standard of living, and there were a lack of job opportunities in South Korea. The war completely devastated the peninsula. There was fighting up and down the entire peninsula. My dad often talks about it and says, like, there wasn't a building left standing. It was really devastating. To recover from that takes many years. So the economic system in South Korea was very troubled, right, even at this point in 1965. So there's a lack of job opportunities. There's also political insecurity and a lack of political freedom. You have a military dictatorship in Korea from 1960 to 1987. Another reason Koreans came to the US was to access education. I'm going to talk more about what the education system looks like in Korea today, but it's extremely competitive, and it was extremely competitive to get into colleges. And then if you got into colleges and you graduated, it was really hard to find a job. And so a lot of Koreans ended up coming to the US for access to education. And also, media images of the US. Because the US was in Korea militarily, there was a lot of American culture in Korea. And so a lot of images that people would see on TV were these images of a very wealthy nation. And that also would be a draw for people to come to the United States. Okay, so for the last part of today's talk, I wanted to focus on this third assumption that people make about me, which is that I'm really good at math, okay? This is linked to this broader myth or thesis called the model minority myth, which some of you may have heard about. So there's this idea that Asian Americans are either like super smart at some things, right? And that they're kind of these model citizens. And this is linked to this idea of the model minority thesis. There's this idea that Asian Americans have kind of pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. They put their heads down, they focus, they work really hard, and they succeed, okay? And there's also this assumption about Asian Americans that we are politically silent, right? So we don't complain. We just come here, we work hard, and we make it. So one of the problems with this model minority myth is that it pits Asian Americans against other minority groups, okay? A lot of people, some people have said, you know, African Americans and Latinos, they should follow the example of Asian Americans, and then they would be fine. They'd be doing much better economically, they'd have high education attainment levels, and that kind of comparison, of course, erases a very long history of structural racism and institutional racism that plague African Americans in particular, but also Latinos in this country. And so there are these insidious ways in which African Americans and Latinos cannot access loans, right, to buy homes. There's all kinds of redlining that happens, access to educational opportunities. The model minority thesis doesn't factor or account for those kinds of historical differences. Okay, so that's one problem. Another problem with the minority myth is that it is not always accurate when it measures Asian American success, okay? And then, of course, Asian Americans, as we know, there are a lot of different kinds of groups encompassed in this Asian American group. Not all Asian Americans are doing well, right? If you're coming to this country as a refugee escaping from war, say from Vietnam, Cambodia, or Laos, that is a very different reason to come to the United States than it is to come here to, for occupational reasons, right? Okay. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about really quickly to debunk this model minority myth is that, you hear, well, there are a lot of Korean Americans who are here at USC. There are a lot of Korean Americans at elite universities across the nation, right? And I think that there's this assumption that Korean Americans, they're generally smart, they go to Ivy League schools, right? And if you look at statistics, that might be true to a certain extent. But what you don't see is the very high dropout rate for Korean Americans. The dropout rate as of a few years ago was 44% for Korean Americans at Ivy Leagues, okay? And this has a lot to do, there are a lot of sociologists who have looked into this, and they believe that parental pressure is what got them in, but the lack of adaptability is what makes it so many Korean Americans are actually dropping out of these elite institutions. Another thing that isn't factored in to the model minority myth, or the idea that Korean Americans are, have reached middle class standing, is that they're not taking a close look at what Korean employment really looks like. So I wanted to show you here. So I'm sure you've noticed that a lot of Korean Americans own small businesses, okay? The big ones are dry cleaners, liquor stores, greengrocers, especially on the East Coast. Restaurants. I wanted to find a picture of my parents in their dry cleaning shop, but I couldn't find one. My parents would kill me, but I couldn't find one. Okay, so for example, my parents have owned, I think, 4 dry cleaning businesses throughout my lifetime and since their time here in the U.S. And one of the things that you don't see is the long hours that they work and hidden free family labor. So every summer when I was in high school and when I was in college, it was just a given. I worked at the dry cleaners. I'd start with my parents. We'd start at 7 a.m. and we'd stay there till 7 p.m. This was through the weekend too. We closed on Sundays. And I just never really questioned it. I mean, they needed the help and they couldn't afford to hire anybody. And so this is just what I did for many, many summers. And I wasn't getting paid. Well, they were housing me, they were feeding me, but I wasn't, getting a paycheck, right? So this is pretty typical, I think, of a lot of small businesses where you have family members who are working in the small business with you, and they're not getting paid for their services. Okay, so that's one thing. The long hours is another one. Greengrocers, they're up at 4 in the morning going to get all of the vegetables and the fruits and everything that they need to set up shop. These are very long days. And so when you say that Korean Americans are, their net worth, in 1 year is a certain amount, you're not factoring in the fact that they're working, way more than 40 hours a week, and that they're also employing free family labor. So those are a couple other things that kind of complicate this idea of the model minority myth. Another thing that contributes to this idea that Korean Americans are somehow this ideal citizen is that so many Korean Americans are Christian. And Christianity is, in terms of a dominant religion in the United States, is the dominant religion in the United States. And so it meshes with what already exists here. So I'm sure that you've seen, and many of you may attend, but you've seen Korean churches. They're kind of all over the place. You've seen the Korean vans, right? They're all over. It's estimated that 80% of Korean Americans are practicing Christians. Okay, 80%. That's a really large percentage. It's also said that there are over 4,000 Korean American churches in the United States. Okay, so this is not an insignificant part of Korean American identity. And this links back to a very long history. There were US missionaries who were in Korea in the late 1800s. It's said that Korea was one of the most successful foreign missions in history. And a lot of the missionaries who were in Korea encouraged Koreans to come to America. So that first wave of immigrants from 1903 to 1905, many of them are Christian because they were encouraged by US missionaries to come to the United States. So you could already see, right, that legacy, that very long history of Korean Christianity in the United States. It goes back to that first wave of Korean immigrants. Here's an image of one of the first Presbyterian Korean churches in the US. And here's an image of Yongnak Presbyterian Church in LA. It's one of the larger ones. So why is it that Korean Americans are so Christian. And by the way, in Korea, that rate for Christianity in Korea is not 80%. It's much lower. I don't know what the latest statistics are, but they're much, much lower. I want to say less than half of that 80%. So you don't have that prevalence of Christianity in South Korea, but you have it here in the United States. So what is it about the church, and what is it about Christianity that is such a draw for Korean Americans? The Korean church, it's a social community as much as it is a religious one. And many attend Bible study groups during the week, and then on Sundays, there's worship, you take English classes, you have lunch together. It's an all-day affair, and it's usually a family affair. So the church becomes this place where Koreans can, especially recently immigrated Koreans, can find support, right, being with an immigrant community, and get tips on sociocultural adjustment here in the United States. It's also a place for resources for Korean Americans. So we just talked about how there's so many Korean dry cleaners and how there's so many things. That is not by mistake, right? When Koreans come here, you learn what other Korean Americans are doing. My parents learned about the dry cleaning business from their friends who were in Arizona when they first moved here. And then they've since taught that dry cleaning business to other Koreans who have come to the United States. Okay, so it becomes this resource for Korean Americans. For second generation Korean Americans, it becomes a location of identity formation. This is a place where they can go to find others who are like them. And they grapple with everything from generational differences from their parents to their hybrid identity, their hybrid Korean American identity, which they can practice unapologetically, right, in this kind of a space. It's very much a religious group, but it's also a social group. You know, there's bowling and eating and going to K-Town, and there's all kinds of activities that are built into it as well. And if you notice here on USC's campus, and pretty much any college you go to, there's almost always a Korean Christian organization on campus or an interfaith organization on campus, and that exists for similar reasons. All right, so who are Korean Americans today? We're an incredibly diverse group, but I wanted to talk a little bit about immigration since 2000. In the early 2000s, immigration from Korea remained at around 25,000 annually. That's a pretty big number. You guys were probably too young to remember this, but there was a huge Korean financial crisis in 1998. Were you like 6 at the time or something, right? Okay, so in 1998, there was a huge financial crisis in Korea, and that led to high unemployment rates, which also led to increased immigration here to the United States. There's also been, since then, a very large influx of international students. There are a lot of international Korean students here on USC's campus. There are a lot of international Korean students on pretty much any campus across this country. It's still really difficult to provide an education for children in Korea. It's very competitive. If you want to get a good job, you have to go to the top universities. And if you don't, it still remains very difficult, I think, to find a job afterwards. And so a lot of Koreans are coming here to get their college education. So in 2009, approximately 86,400 Korean students studied in US colleges. 86,000, that's a very large number. English language skills are really important for the Korean job market, given the global economy. And 80% of these students ended up staying on in the United States, becoming permanent residents after they graduated. Another group of international students are much younger. They're in elementary school or middle school, and these children have been called the parachute kids. I don't know if you've heard that term at all, but these are the kids who usually come over with their mom. They usually come over with their mom, they study here, the father usually stays on in Korea to make money, and again, it's to provide their children with an education that is going to lead to something. And just to, so 25,000 Korean elementary and secondary students per year study abroad in the US. And to give you a sense, like in my family alone, I have 6 cousins from 3 different families who all came over with 3 different aunts. One family lived in New Jersey. When they learned English, they had a heavy New Jersey accent, which was also very funny. Another group ended up in the state of Washington. And now some of my cousins are in college and they're still here. One's going to Art Center. now. So this parachute kids thing, it's a real thing. Another group that comes in still to this day are Korean adoptees and military brides. So yes, this was connected to the war. It started as a result of the war, but this immigration continues to this day. The number of Korean adoptees that are coming to the US, it has declined, but since the Korean War, there are over 150,000 Korean adoptees living in the United States. The numbers are declining, but they are still coming. In terms of military brides, there's still a US military presence in Korea. It's much smaller now. The last time I checked, I think it was under 20,000. But these military marriages are still occurring, and there are Korean military brides who are coming to the United States. Many Koreans are out marrying, the sociologists call it, or marrying outside of their race. So you have a growing population of mixed race Korean children, multiracial Korean children who practice a Hapa identity. There are many second and subsequent generation Korean Americans who are becoming involved in politics. I have a statistic for you. In 2008, 59% of Korean Americans voted for Obama, yet the majority of Korean Americans are Republican. And that first wave of Korean immigrants that we talked about, who were very much connected to what was happening in Korea, primarily because of the Japanese colonization of Korea, that has changed. And more Koreans are becoming involved in politics here in the United States because this is where they are living. Of course, there is a very large YouTube presence for Korean Americans, for Asian Americans in general. YouTube has become this place for second and subsequent Korean Americans to go and create their own identities, tell their own stories, and represent themselves in a way that mainstream media cannot. I think that's how YouTube is for a lot of groups. And then we can't forget about Psy and Girls' Generation. This global pop culture coming from Korea in the form of Psy, in the form of K-pop bands, in the form of Korean dramas. I don't really know what kind of a message they're sending about Korea, but it's certainly complicating the idea of who Korean Americans are. It's definitely put Korea on the map, I think, for a lot of people, these particular stars. Okay, so where are Koreans headed? I have no idea. But what I do know is that first generation Korean Americans are still very much tethered to Korea. So if I think about my parents' generation, they still have lots of family in Korea. They will never forget that war. They're very interested in what's happening, especially in terms of what's happening in North Korea and nuclear proliferation, the possibilities of reunification. These are things that are very much top of mind for my parents' generation. And for second and subsequent generations of Korean Americans, it really remains to be seen. This is a group whose identity exists somewhere between two cultures. Many Koreans speak Korean at home, but English everywhere else. Some are at the forefront of community activism, especially after the Los Angeles riots, which happened very close to USC's campus in 1992. And so I know that I talked about a lot of things today, going back to the 1850s, but what I hope is that today's talk adds some more dimension to who Korean Americans are. I also hope that it complicates those three questions or assumptions that are often made about Korean Americans. And I guess I just want to end by saying that Korean Americans are a very diverse group of people with shared pasts but varied presents and futures. Thank you very much.